please.
Yeah, so I would have a question actually for both presentations. First to Nora. I actually agree that I would say that something very similar is happening in Europe as well. I mean, if you look at countries with a very informal asylum system, like, for example, Greece, I think you would find very similar things. For example, I think in like earlier phases, asylum seekers in Greece would not necessarily get a normal procedure, but just a stamp saying this person doesn't qualify, and then they have no grounds to challenge the decision on. So I think very similar things are happening there, and that would be really interesting to look into. And actually, until today, I was ignorant of ignorant studies. I didn't know now, but it's actually really, really helpful. I agree for studying asylum and migration policy making. And I'm working on a project on kind of quality of government, for example, in Greece, and then kind of how that impacts on asylum decisions. And so my question would be kind of related to that, because my let's say project partners, they're always like, oh yeah, but maybe not knowing or having, like, let's say a less effective bureaucracy can sometimes also help asylum seekers. I mean, obviously there's always a bit of arbitrariness in this, but maybe did you find situations where perhaps the ignorance from the side of the, let's say, decision makers or people involved in giving some kind of status or protection to people actually helped asylum seekers? And then a question to Mikołaj would be, so you also mentioned that this, and I quite like that you said actually in a way, a certainty was created, not so much confusion, but a strange certainty that wasn't actually there. And this also happened through an interplay of politics and media. And I was wondering if this interplay between media and politics was the same across your countries, or if it also was different. You mentioned, I think in Romania, it was not so much politicized, that kind of changed the dynamics a little bit. Thank you.
I think we can start answering the question right away, and in this way it will be easier for me to check the time and how much time we've got left for the next question. So
thanks. Is it okay if I answer the question first, because then
yeah, sure.
I can cheat and also ask a question to Mikołaj, and then he can maybe take them both.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the question, Natascha. Yeah, no, this is, I for a long time I wasn't, I was so focused on my country and my case that I also didn't really see the parallels, but especially with the implementation of the hotspot system, I think kind of the strategic adoption of non-registration and non-policy in the European context is actually very blatant. But then, yeah, it's a very good point that you make, that there's also, of course, productive effects of uncertainty and ignorance, not just for authorities, but also for refugees. It's not only kind of marginalization and oppression. And I've heard that, I've encountered it a lot, especially when it comes to the non-implementation. So they say there's two things where there's no regulation to begin with. Yeah, they say sometimes that works sometimes to the benefit of refugees. I think it does, for instance, in eviction cases that I've studied, where refugees in informal settlements are now threatened with eviction. There they actually use the fact that they are informal, but also that they have no opportunity to be formal, that these avenues don't exist. They use that in their own defense. They're saying, well, you know, you cannot oblige us to have done it any other way because you haven't provided any other way. So there, that's definitely evident. Also, for the very repressive policies that are there sometimes, then of course non-implementation is a good thing. So they also find it often, refugees themselves see this as a benign thing, that authorities look away or squeeze their eyes, as I've often heard. But I think for me, so that's important to recognize also in terms of refugee agency, and not, I mean, they're not just, you know, only victims of this ignorance imposed on them. They also kind of strategically reappropriate that. Having said that, I do think that on the bigger scale of things, the whole idea of creating this discretionary power is that it works to the benefit of people who already are in a position of power, and that's usually not refugees unless, of course, we talk about the specific self-proclaimed leaders of some refugee communities that are very complicit in continuing the status quo based on informality and uncertainty. So yes, there's instances. I wouldn't overplay it though. But I'm really curious to see what you come up with. And for Mikołaj, thanks a lot for the presentation. I mean, a lot of that was new for me, and I don't know. I'm not sure if I understood everything correctly. But one of the things I found interesting, the focus on the future, saying, okay, with in a crisis is this projectivity on the future, and thereby creating, kind of conjuring up some visions of a future, and thereby ignoring others. And I wonder what then the role of the past is, and ignorance of the past, because futures are often kind of based on idealized past or traditions. So then how do particular projections of the past, and also the particular non-projections or ignorance of other things that have happened in the past, play into that? Maybe you could speak to that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Maybe I will start with Natascha's question about the differences between the political debates and about this interplay of politicians and media. So what we notice here, and maybe for people studying political discourse or media discourse, is also not something very new. It's like these are two elements of feedbacking mechanisms. You have media, which has these various tendencies to scandalize or dramatize their narratives, and they are open for politicians to present their views, and sometimes also they're using this this dramatization. So what we found in part of the literature is like, and it's quite common in immigration scholars circles, is to blame the media. Yes, they're blaming the media of producing this negative picture of migrants generally, or refugees in that case. But well, politicians are very skillful in using the mechanism of mediatization. And I don't want also to put the whole blame on politicians, but the general lesson for us is that it's no one to be blamed as a one bad character in this story. Yes, it's to blame for actors, general actors, and the interaction between them, which sometimes is producing a discourse which is not controlled by anyone at all. Yes, so there are sometimes this mechanism when they are losing the control, especially if some politicians are purposively starting fear-mongering campaigns. They're also losing control over it, and the differences between the three countries is the case of Hungary. It's quite easy. Viktor Orban used the 2015 events in order to mobilize the support for his rule, to attack the political opposition toward him. In Poland, it was more or less used similarly, but it was used by the political challengers. We had the elections in October 2015, and the main challenging party constructed the future with all the tragic consequences of relocating refugees to Poland in order to blame the government, which was incumbent at that time, and they managed to win the elections, partially thanks to this. Of course, there were some other reasons, but it was a huge tool for political mobilization for them. And in Romania, there was no such situation. There was no situation of elections. There were different lines of political conflict. So, of course, the situation was very much mediatized, but it was not used in order to construct the political differences between the major actors in Romanian political scene. And very interesting question from Nora regarding the past and ignoring the past. And I think yeah, it's always worth mentioning it, because actually one of the first relocation mechanisms in the modern history of asylum policy was designed for the Hungarian refugees. And quite often in this discourse about what happened in Hungary in 2015, it is mentioned, come on, so many people ran away from Hungary in 1956, and they were then moved to other countries which negotiated how to share the burden of keeping several 100,000 of people who ran away after the suppression of the revolution in 1956. And now you're the face of anti-refugee debate in the European Union. And of course, there are this very interesting mechanism, and of course in smaller scale, but in Poland the same arguments were also risen, because in the 80s there were also refugees from Poland fleeing after the martial law in 1981 and so on. Yeah, but it's very easy to either ignore that kind of a past, either to reconstruct this past, and especially I think in case of Hungary, this figure of deserving refugee or the real refugee was employed. Yeah, so yes, they were beautifully, and also the racial element was in it, constructed the Hungarians running from the communist oppression as the real refugees who required help, in comparison to the current 2015 refugees, which according to Orban propaganda were pictured as not real refugees, as people who are looking for a better life, or even people who should be fighting for their countries or whatever. Yeah, so this using past in order to deal with the current situation and produce the future always involves creativity in ignoring and constructing what we know about the past. And this is just one example, but I think quite striking, quite brutal in a way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions for our presenters?
I would like just to add something regarding our research, and then I think this can be taken as a question for Natascha and Nora. So what we noticed also when we are dealing with these three crisis countries at the level of the national authorities is that okay, now retrospectively it seems that they were like these actors who were more or less rational, who knew what they wanted, and they were like evaluating the situation and changing their strategies. But we also encountered a lot of like signs of uncertainty, and for example the Romanian government especially at some point the situation that was that they were remaking the future, but they were like putting this into this, they were basically waiting if the refugees will come or not to Romania. So there were these moments of Mikołaj called it like a field level production of ignorance. So even though the government, maybe he would have liked to engage with strategic ignorance, but there, he was also like this lost actor at some point. So my question is, because I think when it's, there is like a tendency to present it like a rational game and like a politics of ignorance and uncertainty, and we notice that there are these you can tell the story in this way, but do you notice these elements of like lost real or lost scope for when the national authorities are simply waiting, they don't know what to do, and then they even wait for the refugees to show what is the trajectory of the refugees, because the Hungarian government at some point he was completely dependent on what Austria was doing and the refugees were doing in terms of its projections. So this would be our questions.
That's actually a very good question. I think in 2015 there were lots of situations like this. I mean, also I think of, for example, the German response. I think there's also some people now saying, okay, actually, like Germany opening the borders was almost something that happened by accident, because there was this tweet of the BAMF, and then saying kind of, yeah, we don't send Syrians back to any other European country, so we're no longer implementing Dublin, and then that led to a lot of people coming, and then Germany opened its borders, but then hoped that other countries would perhaps follow suit, and that didn't happen, and a lot of, I mean, I think we see that in a lot of countries at that time. So it's often kind of ex post rationalized, but a lot of the reaction was definitely not strategic or rational in any way, just kind of wait and see approach.
Okay.
I mean, I can maybe add to that from the Lebanese perspective, because I think this is a really good point and something I've struggled with a lot and haven't actually resolved either. But for me, what comes into, and this is I think also a fundamental difference between the European context and the regional refugee countries, right? Because there's often exactly that, like, so there's this notion that European countries are per definition rational. So that's our assumption. And then indeed, it's important to bring in that sometimes they're not, they're just, you know, just faking it till they're making it, I don't know. But then it's the exact opposite with regional refugee countries, where the assumption is that they have no idea what they're doing, right? That it's all failure and it's all weakness and it's all a mess, and there is no strategy and there is no rational actor because they're not capable of that, right? So for me, it's actually been the opposite. I wanted to show that apart from, yes, the weak state structures that have to deal with completely disproportional numbers of refugees, there is actually also strategic and rational dimensions to it. So it's also, I guess, kind of what dominant discourse you're trying to remedy or nuance or speak to. But then I do think also in that context of Lebanon, for me, it was really important to see it as kind of levels of strategy. So sometimes there are instances where very clearly Lebanese actors just say, we don't want to know. We are not going to count the number of refugees. And we are not allowing the UN to do it. So that's not a capacity issue because someone else was doing it for them. And then they said, no, you're not allowed to. And that's very clear kind of production of ignorance that has very clear strategic aims. But more often it's very diffuse and it's very kind of structural. And it's also not something just done with refugees. I think it's also in the Lebanese context, a general situation where not making decisions is just the politically convenient thing to do in any case, on any issue. So I think that also opens up interesting avenues to question, like, to what extent this is particular to migration or refugee governance, or whether it's just a window on how these things work more generically. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Thank you. I just want to take a minute to welcome Lindsay McGoey, who just joined us a few minutes ago. And she is the author of Strategic Ignorance term, and she studied this widely. And this was mentioned a few times today in your presentation today. So hello, Lindsay. And thank you for joining us. And she was also our special guest in 2018 Unintended Consequences workshop. So you can also take this opportunity.
Thank you. Great to be here. Sorry, I'll try to get the video going in a sec.
Hello, Lindsay. So if you can also take this opportunity perhaps to ask Lindsay, or Lindsay, if you have anything you want to comment or add to our discussion, you're very welcome. And are there any questions you want to ask our presenters?
No, I apologize. I was late. I got the timing wrong. I thought it started at 12:30. So I'd rather just sit back and listen for a while and hope to have something to contribute later on. Sorry to be late. Thanks.
No problem. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Rui, please ask. Oh, you have to unmute yourself. Rui, you have to unmute yourself.
You are right. You are right. Thank you very much. I would like to, I don't know if it's a question, but it's more a comment for you, the panel today, because since I have been here, or I am here in Germany, in the south from Germany, I was talking with several German people, and because the question from refugees crisis, somebody asked and answered my question, saying that this is not a responsibility from the communities to engage the refugees, but is the responsibility from the state. And my comment not is a question for you, the panel. how you see the importance from the private and the public sector in the context from refugee crisis here in Europe. This is a question for you, for three both, the importance from the private and the public sector to manage this kind of crisis, like a refugee crisis.
So I think in Europe, I mean, a lot was actually happening from the private sector, right? Groups, so civil society organizations, some groups that really just kind of built ad hoc, that really played actually an important role here. I mean, again, if you look at countries where perhaps state capacity is lower, like for example in Greece, where there were problems kind of accommodating refugees, also for example in Italy, I think a lot of actually things that are usually done by the state, by the government, are not really provided, and then really kind of civil society organizations, NGOs have to kind of jump in and support refugees, and I think they're really doing a very good job. But a problem is indeed that actually these things should be provided. I mean, especially kind of access to accommodation. That's not a problem so much in Germany, but again in some other European countries, access to food or kind of financial support and or legal support, and that very often is really just only done by civil society organizations, where it actually should be done, kind of provided systematically by the state, because otherwise we again have this arbitrariness that maybe some people get it, but it's not really provided for everyone. But of course, I would agree that it's actually, I mean, civil society organizations have played a really important role in 2015 and after that. I mean, even today, I think in lots of European countries, they play an important role.
Okay, we have a few minutes. If there are a few minutes left, if there is anyone else who wants to ask a question. If not, then I have a question, but I was just waiting for anyone else. Okay, so I have a question and a comment, Mikołaj, to you and to the way you analyze the media content in your project, because you use this term projectivity with reference to presenting future. And one question is that, is this projectivity usually presenting black scenario or other, did you identify any positive kind of views regarding the future? I'm asking this because this term, what you say, this projectivity, this you identified, is very similar to Stanley Cohen term from Moral Panic. He uses prediction, and in Moral Panic studies, predictions done by media are always negative. So the role of prediction is to maintain anxiety and fear in society. And of course, in relation to refugee crisis and migration, we can talk about moral panics in Poland, definitely in 2015, 2016, that it was obvious that there was a creation of moral panic. So my question was, is this projectivity as similar to prediction, which is always negative, or can you give an example of positive scenario? And you mentioned the example of Hungary and Hungarian, but Hungarian refugees in 1956, and I was wondering to what extent giving example from the past were always positive example, whereas this projectivity is always negative. Would you say that there is some kind of pattern when it comes to looking backwards and looking forwards? Thank you.
Okay, the thing about the projectivity in the media is much easier to be answered. Well, it was already found out by Stanley Cohen in the 70s, yes, and this is a common knowledge in the media industry that bad stories sells better, yes. So and we can also see it in our research materials. For example, all in Polish case, there was a campaign run by several organizations, newspapers, and our authority's official name is Office for Foreigners, who is responsible for managing on the managerial level the asylum policy, with the idea to tell the truth how this designed policies of European Commissions look like and what would be the consequences, how many people are going to come, how they're going to be accommodated. It was quite a lot of effort put in that, and of course that sort of story is not very dramatic. And what's also very interesting, and what we find out in our research material, especially one from Poland, is that quite often this, let's say, positive stories about the future were being said as contesting the negative stories. So they were all the time reproducing what became dominant. Yes, this black future scenarios, dark future scenarios were dominant also because they had to be contested, and when you were contesting them, you had to repeat them. So if you would be only counting the use of certain adjectives in material, you will have a majority of the negative one, but some of them were in the text which were trying to produce the positive future. But they have to describe how the let's say antagonists of that text believe the future is going to look like. Yeah, so for various reasons and for the mobilization around this negative projections of the futures, the positive ones were ignored. It's not like they are not existing, but it's easier to ignore them. They are not mobilizing all the emotions. It's really, yes. And in that case, they were ignored. The question about the past, it's much more interesting and it's much more harder to answer it. So it could be now only in a kind of an ad hoc answer, but quite a lot of mythologies, especially in case of Poland and Hungary, also quite nationalistic mythologies about the national past were employed. Yes, heroic Hungarian refugees, revolutionaries of 1956, running away from the country. As I said, it was similar, but on not so important scale in Poland. The members of democratic opposition in 1980 running away from the oppression of the Communist Party, although we know people who study migration that actually the majority of immigration in 1980s from Poland was also economic migration. It was not people who were involved in the democratic opposition, but they were using the positive attitudes in Western Europe toward people immigrating from Poland for it. So the real story, if there can be a real story, is much more complicated, but the mythologies about the past, yes, they're also using kind of a, protagonist figures which are hyper positive, yes, and it is easier to recall them. So there might be something like this. It's easier to find so-called positive examples in the past and negative example, to point to negative examples in the future, but I would have to think about it, and yeah, it requires some much proper theorization.
Unmute. It's almost time to so I think we have to stop here. And oh yeah, there is one more question. Go ahead then.
It's not a question, just a remark, and I don't want to bother you with a lengthy explanation, but actually everything that Mikołaj presents and he found would perfectly fit with the Ouroboros model. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, brief comment. Thanks. So we will have a longer break now.